says, yes, and they put me in hope and fear, these images. And an interpreter says, well, keep all things so in thy mind that they may be as a goad in thy sides to prick thee forward in the way thou must go. That is to say, allow this text to prick you, to motivate you. That is to say, propedeutic, as we have sometimes said. Right? Section 5, Christian's back on the highway, and the wall of salvation he sees at the cross and tomb. The burden backpack falls. We'll think about in Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Remember when he finally blesses the animals unaware? What happens to the albatross that's been tied around his neck at that moment? It what? Falls off of his neck and into the sea. We have the same thing happening here with the backpack. Christian will weep. 3 angels, shining ones they're called, will say your sins are forgiven. They change his rags into clean clothes. They set a mark on his forehead, and then they give him a scroll, which will become important later in the poem. He's back on the road. He sees 3 sleeping men. Put it in your notes. Sleep in this poem is always allegorical for laziness, unless it's restful, peaceful sleep that's been provided. Simple sloth and presumption are there. They want to remain asleep. We're thinking here about Republic 7 and the ways in which the individual young man who is about to be emancipated and wants to be put back and chained up. 2 men will approach him, formalist and hypocrisy. They have a short chat about this shortcut that they found over the wall of salvation. Christian will rebuke them. That is to say, there is no shortcut to salvation. This notion that the journey is long and hard is, of course, going to begin with our study of Homer and, of course, Virgil's Aeneid. But here we'll hear the same game being played all over again. I'll share a couple of lines with you really quickly. There's a song that Christian sings. Thus far did I come laden with my sin, this salvation moment for him. Nor could aught ease the grief that I was in till I came hither. What a place is this, must be the beginning of my bliss. Must hear the burden fall from off my back. Must hear the strings that bound it to me crack. Blessed cross, blessed sepulchre, blessed rather be the man that there was put to shame for me. So these little songs, I just give you one example of many, many of the songs that are going to appear in Pilgrim's Progress. Section 6, Christian comes to a hill with 3 paths, right, left, the narrow way, difficulty. He drinks, we think about Frost's 2 roads diverged in a path, don't we? Christian drinks from the spring, and the narrow path is the way he goes. Formalist and hypocrisy take other paths. Danger and death are waiting for them. Christian falls asleep, this is important, while admiring his new clothes given to him by the shining ones, and he drops the scroll and leaves it. Right, we think, of course, about Christ and the Garden of Gethsemane and that story, and the disciples sleeping. He meets timorous and mistrust running down the hill, afraid of the lions that he's about to meet ahead. Christian is afraid. He reaches for the scroll, and it's gone. He returns to get the scroll. Now it's getting dark, and of course, in the darkness, he is afraid of the lions. Section 7, Christian goes to the palace beautiful. He sees the 2 chained lions. The porter is there. Is thy strength so small? In paragraph 203, the porter will ask. Stay in the middle of the path. By the way, this instructional insult, that's what we called it when we did the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? Especially the Iliad. You remember this? The instructional insult. In other words, I'm insulting you, but I'm not doing it to destroy your spirit, but rather to kind of somehow find you a way for your spirit to resonate, to rebuild, to rejuvenate, just like Virgil, again, up on your feet to the pilgrim Dante. The porter will welcome Christian to the palace, built for Pilgrim's Rest. The palace virgin, Discretion, will talk with Christian and calls her sisters Prudence, Piety, and Charity. By the way, it's often pointed out how this really is a man's book in the first part of the book. That is to say, part 1. And there are women there, but very, very rare, right? It's a man's story. Prudence and Piety discovers what Christian all about Christian's life. While a meal is being prepared, Christian says, I think less of home, he says, and more of a better country. This idea about what? You don't even think about your wife and children back? He says, I still, though, think of the sinful pleasures. That is to say, the things of the past and all of that. He says that he has a conversation with Charity about his family, and Charity will in fact say they are not to blame. This, of course, for Bunyan, he took a lot of heat on this one, and so part 2, he will try to address this whole notion of, wait a minute, let me get this straight. You left your wife and children? because they didn't want to come with you on this journey. Like, how's that being a good father? How's that being a good Christian? Again, the answer here that Charity will give is, they had their chance to follow you. They didn't want to follow you. You went on without them. He eats a feast, and he's brought to his bedroom that's called peace. The next morning, he's taken to the palace study, and he sees all these records. The next day after that, he's shown the armory, the battle weapons, and the like. This is, we think about Homer's Achilles and Virgil's Aeneas's shield and all the weaponry that's a part of that. Christian is shown famous weapons: Moses' rod, Jael's hammer, the story of the woman who hammers through the temple of a sleeping man. David's slingshot is all here. At paragraph 264, the sword with which the Lord will kill the man of sin, and the day that he shall raise up to the prey, quote unquote, is all of these are the weapons. The next day, the ladies tell Christian to stay one more day, and the ladies take him to the top of the palace. They show him the Delectable Mountains. We think about the temptations of Christ in the New Testament. He sees Emmanuel's land. The ladies give him his armor. The porter tells Christian, faithful. Another pilgrim is traveling in front of Christian, who will play an important role now in the story. And the ladies, the virgins, will all wave goodbye as he leaves and heads towards the valley of humiliation. In the 8th section, he meets Apollyon in paragraph 273. He's scaled like a fish, winged like a dragon, with a lion's mouth, bear's feet. He spews fire out of his mouth. That is to say, he's a scary monster. So here we go. We're continuing with this motif of the epic that says, if you're gonna write an epic, you got to have bad monsters, and so we'll have some. They converse, and Apollyon will try to win Christian, right? He reminds Christian of all of his mistakes, and Christian says that he's forgiven. Apollyon will get mad. They fight, and here Christian is wounded. He finally defeats Apollyon and is restored to health, leaving or getting some leaves from the tree of life. When we think about our Milton study. In section 9, Christian comes to the valley of the shadow of death. Two people tell him to turn back. There are two major dangers: a deep ditch, the blind lead the blind, they both fall into the ditch, and a swamp. It's a narrow path between the two, and Christian walks it and then finds himself at the mouth of hell. Lots of fire, shouts, howls, gusts of fire. It's going to sound very similar to parts of Dante's Inferno. His shield, all prayer is the name of his shield, protects him. A demon whispers in his ear, though I walk through the valley, I will fear none ill, is the quote, of course, from the 23rd Psalm. And Christian is cheered up because he realizes he's not alone. God is with him, and he might have company with him along the way. In the morning, Christian wakes up to see the first half. The second half, even more treacherous, and light helps him kind of see and avoid the mistakes. The idea of light is significant as well. I put that in my notes. This is another major symbol. Christian sees the mangled bodies or skeletons, the remains of other pilgrims who didn't make it. Beside this is a cave with two giants, Pope and Pagan, and they're the ones who killed the pilgrims. You will have anti-Catholic renderings all the way through this poem as a work of Protestant theology. Christian passes by and sings thanks for the protection through the valley. Section 10. This is the story within the story with Faithful. Outside the valley, Christian sees Faithful. They run to catch up. He runs to catch up to him. Christian trips and falls. This is, again, everything's symbolic, right? Faithful helps him up. Faithful tells him his story. He left the city of destruction after Christian. He avoided the lady Wanton. Potiphar's wife is referenced. He avoids Adam. His house is full of deceit, we're told. And Adam's three daughters of lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And he was beaten up by Moses in the valley of humiliation. He met discontent, he met shame, and of wealth and power because they can't be pilgrims. We're going to see two antis. One is anti-intellectualism in this text, and the other is going to be anti-wealth. That is to say, money can kind of keep you from the appropriate journey, right? Shame keeps whispering doubts in his ear. Christian approves and congratulates Faithful because he says you're keeping on, and that's really important. Section 11, Christian and Faithful talk with talkative. This is a really funny passage. He loves to talk, right? But he doesn't live his theology. And we're going to hear that God is not interested in words, he's interested in actions. Talkative's religion is therefore hollow. They meet evangelist, and he will remind the two of them, you're not yet out of the gunshot of the devil, he says in paragraph 462. They come to Vanity Fair. This is a significant moment in section 11. Vanity Fair, a city set up by Beelzebub, Apollyon, and a legion to sidetrack pilgrims. And the overseer of the fair questions them. He cages them. He beats them. Lord Hategood is the judge. We have Christian, of course, and Faithful guilty of disturbing the peace. It's always significant to be reminded that the early Christians in Rome were committing crimes of atheism, and they were actually branded as atheists. And here we'll have the same kind of thing going on. We've got three witnesses: envy, superstition, and pick-thinker flattery, that will accuse Faithful. He will respond. Faithful then is stoned. He's then burned. Faithful is taken in a chariot to the celestial city. Christian will escape from prison and Vanity Fair with Hopeful, a convert. And they meet buy-ins from the town of fair speech, and they see him as hollow as well, and he deserts them. This is one of those motifs that we want to point out for your notes. Over and over again, on their journey, they will meet with people who are supposedly like them, pilgrims, going to the city of Zion. But they have weaknesses and drawbacks. Most of the time it has to do with not being fully, we might say, committed or engaged, right? Section 12. Buy-ins will be met by Mr. Hold the World, Mr. Money Love, Mr. Save All. I mean, you can get the sense of what these names all mean. They all went to the school called Love Gain in the country of coveting. Again, this whole thing about you can't allow money to be too important in your life. I'm reminded of Thoreau's comment in Walden, a man is rich in proportion to the things he can live without. Very similar concept, right? They discuss what will be later referred to as the prosperity gospel, the idea that if you're a good person, that God will give you lots of Scooby snacks. This text is going to argue adamantly opposed to that idea. Christian will say that man that takes up religion for the world will throw away religion for the world, he says in paragraph 560. And then Christian and Hopeful walk on alone. They come to a plain called Ease, a hill called Lucre, where there's a silver mine. You can see where this one's going, where they meet Damas, the tempter, and he tempts them to look into the mine. And Buy-ins and his pals actually fall into the mine. Christian and Hopeful, they find their way to the river of God, the river of the water of life, and they rest there. They come to Bypath Meadow. They enter it. Vain is a vain confidence is a man who falls into the pit, as well as being lost and afraid, right? And a storm comes, a voice tells them, let your heart guide you. They nearly drown, and they find a little shelter to wait out the storm at the conclusion of the 12th section. By the 13th section, we're in the morning, the giant Despair from Doubting Castle will capture them. And then you have Giant's wife. Again, I told you, you don't have very many women in this story, but Diffidence is the wife, and she tells the giant to beat them. She tells the giant, you better advise them to commit suicide. It's interesting, Christian actually is so afraid that he might think about committing suicide. But Hopeful will say to him to be patient. That is to say, don't take your life. They pray all night, and then Christian has this amazing moment when he realizes that he has the key in his possession that will unlock Doubting Castle, and they can escape. This, of course, playing along with any number of teachings of other traditions that say the thing you want the most, you already possess, you just have forgotten that you have it, right? That famous word picture of the man who went in search of the pearl or the diamond or the jewel that was so valuable, and then right before he dies, he realizes that all of his life he had it stuck inside of his coat in a pocket and didn't realize it. We're playing a very similar kind of game. In section 14, they arrive, because they get away, they arrive at the Delectable Mountains, Emmanuel's land. Here shepherds, four of them, knowledge, experience, watchful, sincere, will guide them. Kind of like Dante with Virgil, they're going to show them some things. They find the hill of error, the mount of caution, the byway to hell, where hypocrites go. And of course, Judas is going to be referenced here. And because Judas is referenced, we can't help but think that Judas, you'll remember with Virgil's help to make it to the center of Inferno, finds, of course, Judas there as well. The shepherds will warn them to be careful and, more importantly, to be focused. By the 15th section, then, they will enter the country of conceit and a young man named Ignorance, and they have an argument with Ignorance. He's wise in his own conceit, paragraph 648 will say, and they pass on. In section 16, They meet turn away from the town of apostasy. Christian tells the story of little faith, kind of like Esau selling his birthright. Christian refers to the book of Revelation and the idea that you have to protect yourself. They meet flatterer, whom the shepherds warned against. They meet shining one, and he whips he whips them for speaking to flatterer, but he does it out of love. In other words, discipline is done in this text out of love. By section 17, they meet atheists, walking backwards toward them. It's just everything's symbolic in this text. They argue. Next, they get to the enchanted ground, warned against again by the shepherds. They converse to stay awake. No resting in the enchanted ground. Again, they are approached by ignorance, and they argue, and ignorance leaves. They argue that there needs to be a healthy fear of God, and ignorance has no healthy fear of God. We're going to come back to him here in a bit. They come to the celestial city. A gardener offers food and drink, and then two men dressed in gold appear. They have to cross the river. Their belief will save them, they are told. Christian starts to sink, however, because of his lack of faith. He focuses on his failings, and Hopeful reminds him, and paragraph 896, Jesus Christ maketh thee whole, and he is saved. They are transfigured from their mortal states, the gates of the celestial city. They enter, and at the very end, and we'll take a look at the very end of part 1, it's an interesting moment. At the very end, you have an interesting exchange that runs. First of all, you have some letters in gold written right outside the celestial city. Blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life and may enter through the gates into the city. And then there it is. The final words, however, of this poem have to do with ignorance. It runs like this. Ignorance shows up at the gate, and they ask, whence came you? And what would you have? And ignorance answers, I have ate and drank in the presence of the king, and he has taught in our streets. Then they ask him for his certificate that they might go in and show it to the king. So ignorance fumbles in his bosom for one and found none. Then said they, have you none? But the man answered never a word. So they told the king, but he would not come down to see him, but commanded the two shining ones that conducted Christian and Hopeful to the city to go out and take ignorance and bind him hand and foot and have him away. Then they took him up, carried him through the air to the door that I saw on the side of the hill, and put him in there. Then I saw that there was a way to hell, even from the gates of heaven, as well as from the city of destruction. And then the very final lines, so I awoke, and behold, it was a dream. This idea, then, that you could make it all the way to the very end. I mean, anyone in a race that's run knows how this one works. You can be leading the pack, get all the way to the very end, and then, of course, you can trip and fall right before the finish line. So we're playing the same kind of game. Okay, so that's the first part of the book. It chronicles the journey of Christian. In the second part of the book, roughly 8 stages is often been divided into. It starts right away with the question about why. Why specifically do we need to have a second part? And Bunyan will, in fact, call this second book, Christina, and we're going to have a female point of view here. I think this is significant to point out for your notes, that we now are going to have Christian's wife who will take her journey. And while we don't have enough time, I wish we did, to read more and to share more about the second part, it's clear that what Bunyan is trying to do is to say 2 things. 1, women have their journey in religious faith as well as men. And 2, that journey is often quite different for women than it is for men in some really fundamental ways. Bunyan will in fact have a conversation with Christina about her objections about having a second book. We have another dream. He speaks with sagacity. Christina and her 4 sons have left the city of destruction, and sagacity will now narrate the story of her pilgrimage. Christina invites Mercy to travel. So again, we always seem to have communal understandings in this journey, right? Mercy to travel with her. That is to say, camaraderie. It seems is even more important in the second than in the first part. They go through the Slog of Despond to the gatekeeper, just like Christian did in the first part, and through the gate. Stages 2 and 3, Christina's boys. Interesting moment. Reminding us of that moment in St. Augustine's Confessions when he steals the pear. The boys sneak over the devil's garden wall and they steal some fruit, and later they'll eat it and one of them will get sick from it. Then they're scared by 2 ill-favored ones, they're called, and Reliever has to help them. Then they're with the interpreter. He shows them scenes just like Christian in part 1. They continue with interpreters, manservant Greatheart. And Greatheart will be kind of their defender through all of this. They see simple sloth and presumption in chains. They climb the hill of difficulty. They rest. And at the end of that, they eat honey. In this moment, there's a lot of talk about how the pilgrimage is difficult. That's what makes it valuable. Okay? In the 4th and 5th stages, they arrive where the lions are, and they are afraid. Grim, the lion monster, tells them to turn back, and Greatheart will kill Grim. We have more of this actual killing of monsters and often beheading. To the porter's lodge they go of the palace, beautiful. Mercy has a great dream there. Prudence tells Christiana's sons, I need to test you, and there's a series of questions that Prudence will ask. It's like an outlining of Christian evangelical Protestant theology, and they pass the test. And in fact, Mother is complimented. Mr. Brisk will court Mercy. It's a fascinating moment. Mr. Brisk will court Mercy, but he leaves her when he realizes that she's too religiously enthusiastic. Bunyan obviously making some point that if you are a man and you are interested in a woman who is religious and enthusiastically religious, you should see that as a good thing, not a bad thing. Finally, Christina's son Matthew will eat the stolen fruit, gets sick, and then has to be healed. Notice that we have an interesting kind of changing of the Genesis 3 story that we talked about when we did Milton's Paradise Lost. That idea that it was Eve that ate of the forbidden fruit. Notice here it's the young boy Matthew, and he has to be healed. They leave House Beautiful. They see monuments to Christians' earlier victories. They enter the valley of the shadow of death, and there the giant maul will appear. Greatheart has to kill him and then cut off his head. We think, of course, of David's killing of Goliath in the biblical account. Stages 6 and 7, they meet Old Honest. They speak of a pilgrim named Fearing. They speak of a pilgrim named Self-Will, and obviously both of these are going to be poor pilgrims, right? The 3 robbers who robbed Little Faith in part 1 will approach. The pilgrims